It's on? It's on. It's on now. It is on. Hello, good evening, and welcome. Those who don't know me, I'm Mary Ryan. I'm the Vice Dean for Research for Engineering, and I was very kindly invited to come along and introduce our speaker this evening and enjoy the lecture and join you for what's now the 5th Lighthill Lecture in this series. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker. I promised I wouldn't labour too long on this, Elaine, so I will be quick. So our speaker is Elaine Oren from the University of Maryland. And I have a biography here. She's doing far too much stuff for one person. So I really won't read them all out. But she's currently the Glenn Martin Institute Professor and Professor of Aerospace Engineering in the James Clark School of Engineering in Maryland. She also has affiliate positions in Mechanical Engineering and the Institute of Physical Science and Technology and the Department of Fire Protection and Engineering. She's an Emeritus Senior Scientist at the Naval Research Labs, currently Adjunct Professor at the University of Michigan, visiting at the Institute of Advanced Study in Hong Kong, and a Distinguished Visiting Professor at Tsinghua University. So there's lots more stuff she's also doing, but I think that's probably enough for one introduction. I'm sure many of you know her work and know she's won many distinguished awards, and I won't take your time any longer because you're not interested in listening to me, but to Elaine. So I will hand over to you. Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Right. The first thing is, can you hear me in the back? Yes? No? Yes. Oh, okay, great. That's the first. Oh, next thing is I need my glasses or I won't be able to see how to push the buttons. Okay. This is an experimental talk. Not only am I going to talk a little bit about experiments, and those of you who know me will probably, now Derek, there's the first joke. We'll probably laugh, but this is also an experiment in putting two totally different pieces of research together, because just the other day by accident, I thought about the results of one of them and it made me, I thought it gave me some insight into the second one. So with a little bit of luck, I'll briefly tell you about both of them, and I'll tell you about this insight that I had, which maybe you'll look at it and you'll say, oh, this is just so totally trivial. You shouldn't even have mentioned it, but we'll see if I can even get there. Now, why did I put the word beauty here? The word beauty is here is because I recently got really taken down for using the word beautiful in a paper I was writing. I had this picture and I wrote, this is beautiful picture, this beautiful flame, I just got totally destroyed by the reviewers. And I decided I was right and they were wrong. It was beautiful. And so I wanted to use the word. And one of the things we do with the computations and the experiments when we're lucky enough is we produce something beautiful. And we produce something that's, well, a picture's worth 1,000 words, a picture's worth $100,000, $200,000 sometimes. It's what you find. So let's start off and see where this takes us. Oh, one other caveat is that the work that I'm going to be telling you is a sort of cherry picking from a lot of different things that happened. A lot of them are based on work that I did I worked 40 years at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. More recently, the work has been at the University of Maryland, and that tends to be the work I'll be focusing on here. I'm very bad at remembering to say my colleagues' names, but I will really try. That could take a whole talk in itself, I'm afraid. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about is a couple of different kinds of what I call reactive flows. And let me tell you what I mean by a reactive flow. It's a phrase that I thought we made up a long time ago because we didn't like the word combustion. We thought it was too limiting. And what I meant by reactive flow was, let's see how this will work. Well, it doesn't work too well. Are flows with some kind of localized energy release that changes the behavior of the flow. You put energy in, you can put it in with a laser, you can put it in with a chemical reaction, you can put it in with a nuclear reaction, but it changes the whole behavior of the flow. Makes it usually a much more difficult problem to solve. Now, this is, if you define it this way, this is a very broad range of problems, which includes all sorts of combustion, flame and detonations, chemical lasers, atmospheric physics, solar physics, astrophysics, all these different things. But there is an underlying theme to all of these flows, and that is a flow, fluid dynamics with localized energy release. Okay? So I'll just mention a couple of these different kinds of flows with different kinds of energy release. Let's go back here. All of these involve reacting flows of current importance. Most of these involve flames and detonations, chemical or nuclear, confined or unconfined, single or multi-phase. Generally, these are turbulent and so on and so forth. The sun's atmosphere, wildfires, mine explosions, aircraft crashes. Some of these are ones you don't want to be around at all. Then there's the kinds of reactive flows where we're trying to control a high-speed energetic flow, such as the new kinds of engines we're looking at, the continuous wave detonations engines, the pulse detonation engines, scramjet engines. Even reentry problems are a kind of a reactive flow. You're coming into the Earth's atmosphere at Mach 44. There's a lot of reactions happening, and the flow is quite different. Now, these systems, all of them that I've described, consist of these fundamental structures of combustion. And these can be flames, detonations, or maybe other sorts of reaction waves. And they're all in the kind that we're interested in under highly stressed conditions. And what I mean by highly stressed is high temperatures, high pressures. Sometimes they're multi-phase, but it's always a non-equilibrium, transitional type situation. Okay? So what am I going to do today? Well, two things, I hope. I am going to focus on turbulent reactive flow transitions, in particular two types of turbulent reactive flow transitions. One of them is the one I've worked on for many years, this deflagration to detonation transition. We call it DDT. You'll probably hear me say DDT, which sounds like something for chemical, for bugs, but I mean deflagration to detonation transition. Now, this is a problem in high-speed, compressible, premixed, and I'm going to be talking about energetic gases. The work we've done has focused on analysis by numerical simulations, and I'll show you some of these because, in fact, they are very beautiful, so it fits the definition of what I want. And I'm going to focus on recent results, some of it very recent. Maybe I'm not going to give all the background and history and personalities that have been involved in all of the development, but you'll see some of the more recent things and conclusions that we've come to. Then I'm hoping that I can control myself enough on this part of the talk to be able to tell you about something very new. And this is not a calculation. In fact, at this point, I can't calculate it, although I feel maybe in the next year we will. It's a very beautiful flame. It looks beautiful. It may be important. It looks like a transition from turbulence. It involves diffusion flames instead of a lot of these pre-mixed situations we talk about in DDT. And it's a very dynamic situation. The whole flame is barely characterized, and the structure is, people are getting very angry over their ideas about what the structure of that is. Okay, so just a little more background here. When we talk about flames and deflagrations and detonations, a lot of our thinking is based on what we learned in combustion, we call it Combustion 101, the very elementary course, where we have to derive this curve here. And it's not so easy to derive this curve. I just make my students do it, and they always stumble someplace. But this is the idea here. You take the full set of Navier-Stokes equations, for example. It can be 3D, the kinds of things we throw onto the computer regularly and we don't think much about. And first of all, we say, okay, let's look at a one-dimensional wave propagation for steady, planar, 1D flow in a homogeneous material. Okay, I've thrown away all the physics that some of us are interested in, that we make our livings on that. We assume conservation, and that these are the conservation equations, and we have a certain amount of energy release that depends on the temperature. And what we're looking at is the locus of final states after the energy release. And what comes out of this is two very distinct regimes of flow. A deflagration regime, which really means a flame, and then the detonation regime. And they differ enormously in pressure, in what happens with changes in pressure. The detonation regime is up here, and the equilibrium propagation of a detonation is a very high-speed flow. Flames, deflagrations are much slower. Now, I don't want to go into all of the background here because that will take me too long and I won't get to the blue flame. But the important point is when you look at this steady state picture, and you derive these equations and you look at what it's telling you, it's not telling you anything about how the deflagration and the detonation are connected. So how do you get from one to another? Well, this is a region that's not allowed here. So it's a question of getting from one to the other. Okay. Now, back up a step and ask a couple of questions. The first of all is, how do you create a flame? Well, you all know how to create a flame. You take some sort of maybe a reactive gas in a box, and you put a little match in or a spark, and you ignite it, and a flame propagates. Well, I'm not going to go into all of how that happens, but I'm going to refer you to a most marvelous lecture by Richard Feynman that you can get on YouTube. It's fabulous. I have nothing to say after that, okay? But I do recommend that because it's mind-opening. So let's go on to the next question, because you all know how to make a flame. How do you make a detonation? Well, there's two ways we know for sure how to make a detonation. The first one is you take the same volume of reactive gas, and you put a huge amount of a bomb in one corner, okay? You ignite this bomb and run away fast, and you look at what you get at the end, and you see if it's a detonation or not. And they call that direct initiation, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, because that's interesting. You don't really know what's going on. You just know what and if it happened. And there are certain markers about this kind of very high-speed, powerful wave that tells you that it does fall into the regime of that diagram they call a detonation. The other way that we've been studying now for a lot of years is this ignition phenomenon from a little spot that's created. It's the flame. You have a violent flame all around, and this ignition to a detonation occurs not in that flame, but in some unreacted material around it, which has been compressed by shocks or heated. Its conditions are changed, and then you get this spontaneous ignition of a detonation from a little spark, little spot. And a lot of work by a lot of famous people, starting with Zeldovich, who is a very famous Russian physicist, has shown how this mechanism of how the spot, with the right kind of gradient of reactivity, will spontaneously evolve into a detonation. And what we've been looking at lately is some sort of strange combination of these effects. So these are really quite different. One of them, you don't know what's happening at all. And the other, with a little spot, you can use numerical simulation and really understand what's happening. OK, that's the wrong way. So I'm going to talk first about direct initiation. That's where you put all the energy in, and you run away, and you look at the end to see if you got the detonation, OK? All right. So how do we do this? Well, this is not something you can really compute too well. I mean, you can compute it, but the beginning parts won't be very sensible. This is something that's measured primarily in experiments. These are some experiments that we had. And this was a detonation tube that was built for us, and it was at Lake Lynn Experimental Mine in Pennsylvania, just north of Morgantown, West Virginia, in a quarry. And the tube was 70 meters long and 1 meter in diameter. And the question we were asked by the mining agency was, would a chamber filled with natural gas, could a chamber filled with natural gas detonate? This is of great importance in coal mines, because you don't want detonations. And the fact that there could be detonations in a mine was something that was not acknowledged by the mining industry, but yet we're pretty sure we know that it happened. And it caused some of the really large major accidents. So this was an experiment not to test something for a mine, but to answer a fundamental question of whether we could produce a detonation in a situation like this. So the first question is, what is required for direct initiation? Because if you can directly initiate it, well, it doesn't mean you could do it with a spark, but it means it could happen if you had enough energy. This is a critical question. So these were my colleagues here, David, Vadim, Carl, and Mike. And this is this wonderful tube filling system that Vadim, who is a great computational person, designed. And all the pieces were welded together by Carl. So my big job was to go out and see, yes, it really did exist, yes, and push a button a couple times and watch the thing fire. Make sure there were no animals that had crept in at night, because that was always dangerous. Okay, if there's a detonation, one of the signs of a detonation are these things called detonation cells, which are very beautiful cellular patterns that the transverse waves in the detonation produce. Again, I don't want to go into all of this physics, but there are a couple of signals, markers they're called, for detonations, laboratory measured detonations. One is the velocity of the wave. Is it that dCj velocity that was on that curve? And the other thing is, does it produce these detonation cells? And what we did is put big steel plates at the exit of that tube, and we looked at the design that was marked out when the wave came by the end of the tube. And we had detonation cells at the limits of which were as big as I was. I could lie down in them. So it was absolutely amazing. So what we did here is a graph of the detonation cell size as a function of the dilution of methane in the air. And this is about stoichiometric. And this is about the limit, which is 5 point something. And this is the lower limit, the lean limit, and the rich limit. And now the size of these cells is an indication of how much energy is really needed to make this transition happen. Okay? Because as we got to leaner and leaner mixtures, we needed huge amounts of energy to make it happen. In fact, we were measuring energy by in terms of bags of methane plus oxygen, which we ignited with a little detonator. And when we were getting to the end, we were up to 3 bags, which I forgot exactly how many megajoules that was, but it was a huge amount of energy. But nonetheless, we came up with interesting limits in the amount of dilution that you could have. And a fascinating thing that I won't give you the answer to right now is why this limits change with the size of the system. But Again, maybe we can talk about that later. Okay. All right, so this is very good. What this is telling me is that if I'm in a coal mine and I have just 5% or 5.2% methanes mixed up somewhere, I could produce a detonation in that mixture if I put a nuclear bomb in. Well, this is not a particularly, this is not good, okay. It's not sensible. But we know we can make a detonation happen in another way. We know that all we need to do in that tube, we can make a detonation with a tiny little spark, with a match, if we just put a bunch of obstacles in the tube. Okay, now this is very interesting, isn't it? Huge amounts of energy to get the thing to detonate. A nuclear bomb's worth, maybe not quite a megaton, okay? But if all I have to do is line up a bunch of little obstacles, okay, in a coal mine I have fallen rubble, machinery, other sorts of things. I need a few obstacles, and I can cause a transition. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this happens now. Should I show you the hydrogen movie or the methane movie? What do you want to see? Methane, I guess, right? All right. Okay. This is the methane. I'm not going to show both because I really do want to get to the end of this talk. Okay. All right, so here's a calculation. And I won't go through the beginning parts for a number of reasons, but what you have here is a long tube. This is 20 centimeters here in length, and this is in proportion. So I think it's a pretty big tube. This is 20, so this must be about 25 here. And there are a bunch of obstacles, and here is, it's ignited. You can't even see the little spark up here. It's a tiny little flame. You'll see it when it starts to expand. The scales are crazy. This is a hard one to see. The scales keep changing, temperature, pressure, x velocity. Just look at temperature. I think that's enough. Pressure keeps flashing and changing on you because the scales have to change. The temperatures can get pretty high. And I'm going to skip the first parts of this because it takes a while for the flame to get set up. And that's perhaps best seen in the other movie. So I'm going to take you through to the point where we have a nice turbulent flame propagating down the system. And maybe I'll go a little faster. All right. So when the flame goes down the system, you have an accelerating wave that produces a lot of acoustic waves. Turbulence produces a lot of acoustic waves. These acoustic waves build up and form shocks, and there it's detonated. Okay? Let me take that a little more slowly. The key here is that you have a very turbulent flame generating acoustic waves. You're beginning to see them in the background in the temperature plot here, which will build up into shocks. So you have a flame which is propagating in a region which has been shocked, so the temperature and the pressure has gone up. These shock waves interact with the boundaries, the boundary layers, and the flame. When a shock interacts with the flame, you get a Rickmeyer-Meshkov instability and more surface area. Eventually, you get nice little Mach stems forming. I wanted to show you a nice little Mach stem here. And when these reflect from the wall, you can get an ignition from a very high temperature that's created when a shock reflects, and it transitions to a detonation here. How do I know this is a detonation? Well, it's got the little cellular structure that form those cells, this transverse wave structure, and you can look at the velocity. So this was a computational proof that we could check actually against experiments to see if the model was any good, the calculation was any good. But the point is, we predict we could, oops, what's going on here? Show that we could get this transition. Now, to give you a little confidence, that was a very big calculation. We could do a couple of 3Ds in our lifetime. Most of them were 2Ds. And 3D calculations, I'll show you a few later on, they're pretty unintelligible. But there is a lot of numerical development through the years that went into being able to compute this for the mining companies and the hydrogen safety companies and so forth. Essentially, we're solving the full unsteady compressible Navier-Stokes equations in as many dimensions as you want and we've solved these same equations for the same problems in order to get people to believe us by 4 or 5 different methods now. The numerical method is extremely important. You need submodels for the local change in the energy release and the chemical reactions. It's necessary to resolve the important features of the flow down to the scale at which something is happening. If you have a flame, you need to resolve the flame thickness. Okay? If you have a boundary layer, you need to resolve that to a certain level in order to have the effects of the interactions of all these waves. You have shocks interacting with flames, shocks interacting with boundary layers, shocks interacting with shocks. This is a pretty crazy turbulent system. And then really what counts here is to be able to compare these two experiments. So we're very lucky in that we had experiments, and I'm hoping in the future we'll have more. But this is a summary of a very large project. Now, a lot of this was over before I went to Maryland, or it's still going on to some extent, because we still have quite a bit of interest from the mining industry. But one of the things we were asked to examine was what happens when, I said I can't compute direct initiation. But what happens if the tube is smooth, has no obstacles? Can we compute that? So one of the things we did was make the obstacles smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? And when we did that, we found there were different mechanisms for the transition to a detonation. It may have taken longer, it may take shorter, but the mechanisms were quite different. In this case, with these very, very small these were small channels, but more than that, there was very small ratio of the sizes of the obstacles. Let me just show you this. This is a Schlieren in the bottom, which is a density difference, and the top is density gradient, and the top is temperature. And I'm going to play it quickly so you'll see. It's just quite a different mechanism here. Let me I'll speed it up. Can't quite make it go in real time, but. So it's just a little spark in the beginning, but it becomes turbulent, and it begins to influence. The flame is subsonic, so it's influencing everything that's happening in the whole domain. Here's some shedding off of the step here. I love this. She's shedding off of those little obstacles. But you can see the flame is really getting quite turbulent as going down the channel. And eventually it does detonate, but it detonates in the craziest way. In this case, what we're seeing happening is 3 or 4 shocks all coming together in one spot and creating an area in which that's the detonation time, an area in which there's huge energy deposition. I mean, a huge amount if you have 3 or 4 shocks all coming to one spot. And that results in a detonation. Now, that sounds to me a little like direct initiation, where you run away and you see what happens. So we're sort of in this funny in-between. Is it one? Is it another? Is it a little bit of both? And this is what we've been seeing lately as we've looked into these things more deeply, the little bit of both situation. Let's get out of here. Okay. Oh, and another curiosity. You're supposed to talk about things you know about, and I always talk about things I don't know about. This was a 2D calculation I showed you. We also did some 3Ds. And this was one of the most interesting things to me about the 3D calculations of these propagating turbulent flame detonation problems, these unsteady problems. This is a 3D version where you're just seeing the surfaces. Slow it down so you can see what's happening. The location of detonation, the DDT, is approximately the same. The mechanism is exactly the same. A bunch of shocks all hitting in one spot together. We've seen them hit together in boundary layers now. We've seen them all coming together near the surface of a flame. But there's something else going on besides little hot spots that I spent so much time studying. Okay, so, and oh yes, and the curiosity there. The curiosity here is that the 2D and the 3D give very similar global results. You can't understand these 3D pictures if you hadn't already studied the 2D pictures and the 2D physics. You'd have no idea what was going on. So you really had to do the two-dimensional. And now, I spent a long time trying to explain why this could possibly be the case, and I can give you a series of arguments for it. But most of them I can also give you arguments against. So this is something that we'll just, through time, have gotten faith in the quantitative nature of these simulations for 2 dimensions when it comes to predicting the results of these problems. Okay. I don't know whether to show you this last one or not. I think I have enough time to do it. Everybody's talking about hypersonics now. Pretty soon we're not going to be allowed to talk about hypersonics, so what I'm going to talk about is high-speed flow, high-speed reactive flow. And this was a simulation that one of my graduate students did. In fact, he just defended his PhD a couple days ago, of a Mach 5 flow in a channel. And the channel is filled with this ethylene-oxygen mixture, for which we did have some experimental data. And I think this is probably a very strange picture, which I'm not sure I can totally explain to you. But it's a long time setting itself up, a Mach 5 flow going through the channel. It's a reactive mixture, and interesting to see what happens. In fact, I think I'll speed this one up for you. So this whole train of shock waves has to set itself up, and this takes a little while. And it finally does, and you can see the flame igniting at the boundary. And this is a low velocity boundary layer, and this is a Mach 5 flow now in the center. And what's really interesting is when it begins. Now the flame, of course, is propagating upwards, very low velocity. And the flow is compressing as it's going through this, the funnel in the center. Get this lovely Mach train picture. And then it begins to go unstable. And this is worth watching. Let's see how fast. Do I want to make it faster? Yeah, why not? Make it a little faster. Okay. Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities at the surface. Compression of the material in the center. And then it detonates. Detonates in a number of places because the temperatures get high enough. Now, this is a very crazy calculation. I'm not even sure what motivated it, nor am I sure what motivated some experiments that were done, which this seems to explain. So here you have a piece of future work. All right, now to a point. a point I wanted to make is you take all of these explosions and you put them on some kind of a picture of the reaction front as a speed as a function of the reaction front position. You could put time down here too if you want. And you get this sort of behavior where the flame begins to accelerate, things start to happen, there's this transition period, everything goes completely out of sight, and then it comes back to some nice steady state. This is the propagating detonation. Down here is a propagating flame. So you go through this transition process right here, okay, in order to get, and finally you get to this. Now I've told you there's a bunch of ways to get to that. This put in energy and run, a little hot spot, put in some obstacles, but this is the picture. The whole idea was synthesized down to a much simpler diagram by a friend of mine from Shell Research, Andrei Pakalsky, who said, okay, this is what we really have. The slow deflagration stays, the fast turbulent flame, this crazy state in between, which is, by the way, really interesting with shocks and flames sort of coupled together, and then this stable detonation at the end. Okay, and that's where I'm going to leave this problem. And I will get back to it again. It's a process, though, of transition that I was interested in. Another problem we've been working on, somewhat by accident, has to do with a totally different kind of combustion reaction system. And this is a fire whirl. Do you know what a fire whirl is? Okay. This is a picture of a fire whirl, one that occurs naturally in a forest fire, urban fires. These things can go up kilometers high. I think this is probably some sort of a helicopter, but I'm not sure. Looks like an insect. What is a fire whirl? Well, a standing vortex which combines wind and fire, okay? The heights range from centimeters to kilometers. It carries smoke, debris, and flames, and at large scales, they behave like tornadoes or dust devils. You can imagine a huge whirling thing with a fire in it, releasing energy and intensifying this whole flow. That's a fire whirl. They occur naturally in urban fires and wildlife fires. These are the tree heights down here, and this is a fire whirl. The tree heights are about down here, and that's a fire whirl going up. So if you go to the web, you go to YouTube, and you Google fire whirl, you'll never stop. You will be lost for years, as I have been. They are beautiful. They're frightening. A friend of mine in Australia told me that she was, during that big fire they had, she saw this fire whirl coming at her house, and she described her emotions to me, and they were pretty strong. So pretty scary. Then I'm going to show you another movie now, not one that I made. Then we saw this movie. Of course, I can't remember how I got onto this movie. It says, becoming so fascinated with fire whirls and going to the web all the time to look for pictures is probably how I found it. But someone who knew what my inclinations were might have just emailed it to me or said, hey, grab this. And so I looked at this movie, and I'd always been thinking if I could find some use for a fire whirl, if we could, the few of us in the community, we could get some funding to set them up and study them, and wouldn't that be great? So that was the fundamental motivation here. And they're big and they're violent. Well, high efficiency for burning or whatever. And we saw this video. Okay, this is from a television broadcast, CNN, and I hope you can hear the sound, because if not, I'll have to narrate.
This towering fire tornado, or fire-nado, was created when lightning struck a Jim Beam warehouse in Kentucky, and 800,000 gallons of bourbon spilled into a retention pond and went up in flames. You have to have exactly the right conditions for something like this to happen. A body of water with a flammable substance on top, and weather conditions that whip the fire into a funnel. Fortunately, the pond kept the fire from spreading, It took quite an effort, but eventually the fire was put out. However, a nearby creek was contaminated, killing many fish. The company paid state authorities nearly $27,000 in cleanup costs for this booze-fueled spectacle.
Okay, stop it right there. Wouldn't you have liked to have smelled that? The movie doesn't tell you what it smelled like. All right, what I saw when this thing was going around, in fact, it was one of my postdocs and I were sitting there, voila, and we saw this big fire whirl on the water pulling a huge vortex of material that was on the surface into it, drawing the material in, drawing the fuel in, so that it could get bigger and bigger. And with it, it drew in other smaller fire whirls and fire vortices, okay? And we watched it over and over, and then the light. Then there was the light. Let's get out of here. The light was this thing here, if I can, yes. What is this good for? Well, why don't we use fire whirls, propose them for oil spill remediation? Now, as a wonderful excuse to study, we actually have this funded. And we're building little ones and then bigger ones, and then maybe someday we'll actually go out and get to remediate something. But they are more efficient in burning, and they burn faster. And so far, the limited work we've done shows that it scales. And the other thing that really encouraged us in this is that in this movie, which was a movie from the Gulf spill cleanup, the two times that when the fire whirl formed, they naturally, by accident, not on purpose, most of the time it was not a fire whirl, the smoke turned from black to gray. So it was cleaner. Well, it was at a higher temperature. So we thought fire whirls would be a good way to clean things up, and they would be cleaner. All right, so a little bit of NSF money to work on fire whirls. We built a standard little experiment where we took well, original one was a square box, but imagine a round tube, quartz tube we have now, cut it in half, offset one half from the other half so that air can flow in here, okay? We poured a little bit of heptane into here, okay? Lit it and ran away. Now, I couldn't light it because I was too short. I couldn't get my hand out in time. So we had to have one of the guys with long arms do this, all right? Now, this is absolutely true. This is what happened. And this is one of the probably the first movie. Fortunately, somebody was there taking pictures for us. Okay, here we go. So we put it in and we lit it. A fire whirl formed. This is where you would light the lights down even more. And then look what happened. The fire whirl went away. Okay.
Oh my God.
That's Wawa. You'll hear AJ in just a minute. I'm not telling you the one where I was talking because that had to be censored. All right, but you see that? Okay. Now, as it turned out, this never went back to being a fire whirl. It stayed there and it burned everything up that was on the surface. It was tiny, as I'll talk about in a minute. It whirled around. Occasionally, when we'd clap or get excited, it would get a little yellow in the center. And finally, it just went out when all the fuel was gone. And we knew all the fuel was gone because we tested the water and we couldn't light it, okay? This is nothing in complexity compared to those experiments. I mean, those computations that I showed you, which took an enormous effort over many, many years. This was just out of the blue. Okay, and I can show you many movies of these. Do I have time for another one? I bet I do. Oh yeah, we got very clever about it. We said we'll put a pump here and we'll pump fuel up into here. So we try to keep this thing going as long as possible. And we found that we could keep the blue flame going once it formed until the reservoir was empty. Okay, so this is one of the ones the university made, a series. I'll just show you these. Let's see if I can figure out how to get the mouse going. Yeah, we can skip this part of it and go to here. Go ahead, okay. Go. All right, same situation again. Light it. Rom writes it because he has the longest arms. We finally got better at lighting it. And it just undergoes this transition. It becomes really very pretty. I actually think this is beautiful. And there's one in particular. We'll just let this one go. My husband says this looks like the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter. And it'll burn until there's no more fuel. I'll tell you now a little bit ahead of time. Subsequent measurements we made showed the temperature right in here was 2,000 Kelvin. So it was very hot. You wouldn't want to put your finger in there. It looks benign, totally blue, no yellow, no soot. And it just burns until there's no fuel. So I think that's enough of this. Okay. Okay. So what have we got? Well, this is not exactly a DDT problem, but there is some transitions going on here. Started off with what they call a pool fire, which became very intense very quickly in the case we had, and became this rotating vortex, tornado-like thing, this fire whirl. These are frightening. The fire whirl was 1 meter high in the lab, and we had to be very careful about the amount of fuel that we put on to the surface, or we couldn't handle it in the laboratory. And then it just it looked to us like it was getting more and more intense in swirling, and then it made this transition. And I'll show you a picture of the transition process in a minute. This is a couple centimeters high. This is the reflection in the water of the blue flame. This whole thing in the lab was 1 meter high, and this says 6 centimeters here. It gets a little bigger. This transitions quickly, in our case, into the fire whirl. Huge differences in size and very clear transitions, okay? The transitions generated the most beautiful pictures because when the blue flame became a little bit unstable, some soot formed in the center. It wasn't so perfect in some ways anymore. And I think that soot that we saw forming was actually acted for us like a diagnostic of what the flow was, a visual diagnostic of what the flow must have been inside that blue whirl. I can't prove that yet, but we suspected that. And these are where some of the most beautiful images came from, is during these little flickers when the blue flame between here and here became unstable for a few seconds. And we could get some good slow motion shots of these. Now, this was a typical sort of unstable, in-between state here, with this violent flame on top and the blue, and sometimes we could see this bubble in the center. And this, again, is the reflection in the water. And this is probably one of the most beautiful ones we got of an intermediate state. And you can see a lot of structure here in this flow. All right, so more information. Here I have a couple more minutes. More information. This was first seen in square pans, okay, in a square dish. So this is not just a round phenomenon. Okay, this is just to prove that it's a general type thing. And now in other configurations, we're looking at this round channel now, this round glass channel container with cut in half and offset. And I think I've spotted it actually in a free fire. It was not only seen at Maryland, but they reproduced it at Princeton and Army Research Lab in Delphi, and I think at UCSD now, maybe other places too. Turns out, and I've read a few other articles of people trying to make them, it looks like it's not that hard to make. You can replace the water. We found you could replace the water with a smooth metal plate. So the boundary layer is very important. A smooth boundary layer is what's needed. Seen with oh yes, here. All kinds of fuels, we can get them now to burn this perfectly blue little flame. Liquid fuels, heptane, octane. Someone gave me a bottle of whiskey. I tried it. I have a movie of that. And this was the big one, crude oil. We could get this blue flame with crude oil. Okay, speculation, it'll burn any kind of liquid. Maybe it could burn other things too. We tried propane, and I don't know if they've gotten it to work with propane or not. Some thermocouple and hot wire pyrometry measurements showed us that the temperature in the middle there was 2,000 Kelvin. And this is the interesting thing. When that blue flame formed, all of the noise in the system went away. It became quiet. The only thing you could hear was the hood. So it made me think, a la Lighthill perhaps, that there was no turbulence. So how do you understand this thing? Well, we have fluid dynamics, chemical kinetics, and all sorts of multi-phase flow issues. Let's forget the multi-phase flow. That's too hard for me. Maybe some other time. We'll just look at evaporated fuels. Fluid dynamics, well, this is where we've been focusing right now. What it looked to us is that what we were seeing was some sort of form of what's called vortex breakdown. And I think if you've studied fluid dynamics, you probably know what it is. Most of the work that I had seen on vortex breakdown was for liquids. And the idea was you take a tube full of a fluid, and you swirl the fluid in the bottom, part of it's in there. And then in time, it changes the mode, usually due to adverse pressure gradients forming. So it's very fundamental to swirl combustion. You get these stagnation points forming and recirculation regions. And the modes that people have picked out have been spiral modes, bubble modes, helical modes. And these are pictures of other people's, I believe these are all measurements that I'm showing here. There's been some simulation. As a spiral mode intensifies, it may transition to a bubble mode and back and forth among modes. Well, that sounds a little bit like what I showed you for that blue flame, doesn't it? You've got the strong spiral mode going very, very intense, then maybe what looks like a bubble mode forming. Now, fire whirls, we know, do transition, show transitional modes. This was a movie done by a firefighter. Again, I got this one off the web, and I can't find the mouse. Here we go. And you can get this was a firefighter, I think it was in Nevada. And you can see it the fire whirl going through a number of different modes. You'll see it break down into a bubble mode in a minute. And here's just one of these whirling modes up here, you see. You'll see that in the simulations, actually. Now, what seems to me is it does intensify, and it also seems to me that he dropped the camera just when we might have seen any transition. Took me a long time to figure that out. But it was boring to him if it looks like it's going out. You see, he had no interest in it at all. And now he's getting bored. And, okay, so it's over. Okay. So one of the sponsors says, can't you call him to get it? And oh, I just can't imagine that. Okay, but this is what we saw with the blue flame. We saw these modes forming when it went a little unstable. And it looks like some of these double helix modes that we're seeing. A bubble mode is what I showed you before. And then the spiral modes way up on top, perhaps. So you can sort of relate this to vortex breakdown. This turns out to be one of the most difficult problems to simulate I have ever tried. And I think it's because the regime of the flow is this low Mach number flow and in a gas. So, I mean, if we were going to simulate this transition, we would have to be able to do vortex breakdown in a gas, reacting gas. So the first thing would be able to simulate vortex breakdown. But it can't be on a small scale. The scales have to be large. So that's, I'm afraid, about as far as we got, almost as far as we got with the simulations here. Let's find this mouse again. These are pressure difference you're looking at. And this is in a gas with a little swirling down the bottom in a long tube. And I think this is closed walls, but I'm not sure. And you can, what I want to show you here is the vortex breakdown. This is the initial setup. And then you see this bubble mode forming. These are just marker particles. They don't mean anything except that they were injected into the calculation down here. And you begin to see the different modes forming. But you see this little bubble mode here. And it looks like the blue whirl is a burning situation that surrounds this bubble mode. This was a tour de force calculation, actually. In order to show that we could actually compute this, we did it, for those of you who know these sorts of things, we did it with both an explicit and a low Mach number code, because we needed a low Mach number code to be able to do the reactive problem. And the explicit was inordinately expensive. So there's detailed comparisons of these that we're publishing now. And this is a picture of the bubble mode, a blow up. I think this is probably worth showing too, because it's quite interesting. So these were just particles that are injected. Where'd it go? Yeah, injected at the beginning. And you just see them. Let's speed it up. There we go. Bubble forming. And this bubble that forms, well, the particles get trapped in that bubble. So you can see that this is a good place for reactions to happen if you're going to catch material in here, and then it'll get ejected. But you can imagine this is like a reactor in the center. We don't know if that's the right model or not. Okay, so that's some. And then we went on to try and simulate a fire whirl with heptane. And that's about where we are now. We haven't driven this thing hard enough to look like the blue whirl, but we can do a fire whirl with heptane. And I'm not going to show this now. I want to get to the point and end this talk before you all fall asleep. All right, here's the questions. And this is what made me put these together. Does it scale, the blue flame? Okay, we know DDT can happen on any scales. It usually happens in a very small region. But we understand that better. This we don't understand. Do these blue whirls scale? Suppose I could make one this big. Well, that would make a cool combustor that could burn anything, right? Is it possible for it to scale? I know I can make them a little smaller, but can I make a big one? Well, I think I saw one in a free fire that was about 6 inches high, but I'm not at all sure. That's different from 2 centimeters. Okay, now here's the real question, which made me think of the DDT problem. Do we have to go through the fire whirl state to go to a blue whirl? Okay. Now, if we do, this is bad. because it means that we have to, if we want to produce a big one, we need to produce a fire whirl taller than this room, and nobody wants a combustor that has to have something like that. There are other questions, such as what is the structure and how does it form? What is required to have a simulation of the flame? Well, that is very difficult, I can assure you. But it's those two questions up there that I am really most concerned about, because it reminded me of this same picture that we put together for the explosions and the detonations. Now, we've had a trick in the DDT to get to the detonation. We put some obstacles in. And what those obstacles did is they changed the conditions of the flow, and they took energy from somewhere to make it possible for this transition to happen, maybe from some sort of potential energy in the flow, which got converted, and somehow you can't get something for nothing here. But we can make a detonation in a very small region now, and we have to for some of these detonation engines. And it's usually with some sort of perturbation in the flow, like these steps. How do I make a blue whirl without making a fire whirl? Or should I not even be asking that question for the next 10 years? I don't know. So that's where we are. That's what made me think that there's some relation here. Because I actually started for some of these problems to put time scales on these and energy scales and never finished the work. The flame is sort of a new idea. Everybody is arguing about what the structure is. It's probably all pre-mixed. Pre-mixed lean, pre-mixed rich, pre-mixed stoichiometric. Whatever it is, it's really interesting fluid mechanics. So with that, I'd like to thank you. And I think I've left more questions than answers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I think we all agree it was extraordinarily beautiful.
Yes.
And the reviewer was completely wrong.
He was wrong.
In that. Yeah, they were just wrong.
He's
you were
crazy,
right.
yeah.
We've got time for some questions. Don't be shy. Yeah.
So very, very interesting talk. Thank you. Quick question about the blue whirl. Very, very interesting work. But when you scale it, do you think it's the mixing rate that would cause?
Yeah.
Okay,
You have to
so
increase the mix.
rate.
I think somehow it's all going to be related to the mix.
Oh, the question was, do you think with the blue whirl, when it scales, is it the mixing rate
Yeah.
that will be dominant?
It's just a larger area. If it gets bigger, it's a larger area, which is going to have to mix just as perfectly. More strain probably on the flame. I don't know if you'll have to have the mixing faster, but over a larger area. I don't know. But I think it scales at least a little. Okay? And I could be wrong.
Let's give you the microphone. So
I'm not a specialist in the talk, but I'm a professor of statistics. My question concerns whether if you look at what you are observing as a time series,
Yeah.
and it may be that there's a change in correlation structure over time
Yeah.
as you go from the bubble mode
Yes.
to the bluer. And I don't know whether you studied the correlation decay rate or something like that.
No.
In between, it may be, like log decay is known to be associated, or correlation versus polynomial, with the change in transition.
Yeah.
In glass, for example.
No. We have
And
not.
it may give a clue. I don't know how you find the correlation.
I think that as soon as we get a simulation of this phenomenon, then we can go in and ask questions. Okay? Right now, it's more a gee whiz type pretty thing and what if type thing. The theoreticians are arguing about the structure. The simulation people are arguing whether it's easy or hard. I personally think it's very hard. But a simulation, just like the simulation taught us about the DDT, it taught us what was happening. It gave us new ideas. Didn't answer all the questions. It gave us more questions. But we had to, mass, momentum, and energy is a function of time to analyze. Here we don't.
Yeah, because it seems to me you're
Yeah.
going from what I would call some sort of chaotic regime to a laminar or quiet
Yeah,
regime.
that's exactly right.
And
Yeah.
it's just to characterize the two by sort of two different equations and the transition in between.
Right.
As to how to do it is I'm not an expert in that.
We'll figure. If it's interesting, it continues to be interesting, or we find it's important, we will find a way.
Would it be worthwhile, perhaps you've done it, particle image velocimetry may
Yes,
make the
PIV.
transition.
Yeah, you know who started some PIV is Lex Schmitz and Katie Hartle. They did some, and I'll tell you the story. They found it very hard because the little thing kept moving around. You know, it circles. It doesn't just sit there perfectly. It's just sometimes it does, but it kind of goes where. I'm sorry, I'm anthropomorphizing this thing. I think it's moving. It's where the fuel is to optimize itself. They did some, and we got some velocity measurements. But there's a person now in Texas A&M who has a lot of lasers, who's going to build a system at the end of the summer and do some PIV for us on it. Absolutely. I hope by the end of
Then that will make a transition to your simulation.
Right.
Mathematical.
Yeah, yeah. But it turned out it was a much more difficult simulation than I had planned on it being. I thought I could.
You were going to do it, did you, after your successes with the DDT?
Oh, I can do anything. I mean, that was so hard. But this one, I think we'll get to the point where we needed a new, to resurrect a new old algorithm to do the fluid dynamics. We couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm.
Hello, I've got a slightly, sorry, over here. Thank you for the talk, it was really interesting. I was just wondering, so you were saying the blue whirl appeared when you put fuel onto this pool of water.
And run away, light it and run away.
Yeah, and then in the container. I was wondering, does that happen like every time you set that light, or do sometimes you get regular fireworks?
No. If we put two, now let me talk to just that container, because we've only done limited experiments. And one time we almost burned the lab down, and they closed us down for 6 months. That's because we put too much crude oil. And the fire whirl got out of hand. And to put it out, we had to run around and look for fire extinguishers, and created so much smoke that it got in the elevator and all the fire trucks came. And we were closed down for 6 months. So we're very limited in the size that we could have. Now, if we put too much fuel in, we get a crazy fire whirl, which might eventually have settled down, but it was too dangerous for us. So we could only operate to the limits of safety. We can put too little in, and then it never gets a chance to form. There is an optimal pumping rate. And one of the students has now tried to put together a diagram of circulation as measured outside of, just on the outside of the fire whirl, as a function of, I guess it's sort of energy release or energy content or something. An A parameter, which is related to the energy, or change in energy, or how fast it burns, I guess. And he's got it in a regime of fire whirls, which is a limiting regime near the extinguishment limit. And he was able to actually find experimentally a way to broaden that regime into the fire whirl regime. But the other thing that I didn't mention is that we can't go directly to I sort of got to this. We can't go directly to the blue flame. We tried that in experiments. Well, we couldn't do it, but again, I told you our experiments are very limited. We could only get we couldn't get to it. So we could only get to it by overshooting and coming down, just like DDT. You always overshoot in DDT, and then you come down. And the pressures you can get in DDT when it overshoots, megapascals, it's huge. I mean, you're going through something with huge energy. And then it comes down very, very quickly to the steady state. In this case, we seem to have to overshoot to get to the blue whirl. I don't think we need energies like megapascals or anything, whatever that. But we couldn't get there directly. That's what I'd like to be able to do, is find a trick to get there more directly. Okay? Yeah. Okay.
Thank
It's more
you.
than you wanted to hear.
Okay, if there are no questions in the interest of time, we'll try and wrap up, and I'm going to hand over to Bill, who's going to close off the session.
Okay, it's my pleasure to give the vote of thanks. I've known Elaine for quite a while, and I've heard her give many talks, and she's always good value for money, and today was no exception. So I start by thanking Elaine for giving us a stimulating and interesting lecture. It's very rare indeed to find anyone covering such a wide range of scales of flows. We saw some of this today, starting with these very small blue whirls, which are essentially laminar flames, up until the very large fire whirls. But of course, her work goes even larger, and where she looks at explosions in supernova. So I can think by thanking you again, Elaine.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
I'd also like to thank the organisers of this Lighthill Lecture series. I think this is the fifth. I think these are valuable contribution to our activities, and so long may they continue. And maybe finish by thanking the audience for making this such a well-attended lecture, although I think that's almost entirely due to the attractions of our speaker. So with that, I'll finish. I think that just about completes the proceedings.